Hi, this is Jonathan. We'll get started in just 1 minute, so just stand by, please. Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. My name is Jonathan Gostand. I'm Vice President of Product here at BugCrowd, and we're going to do a webinar today on bridging the gap between developers and security. Whoops, there we go, got it. I've been working with security for more than 20 years, showing my age here. We can skip some of my background because we're very, very fortunate to have one of BugCrowd's customers, Barracuda Networks, on the call today. Dave Farrow is representing them. Dave, can you say hi and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, this is Dave Farrow. I'm Senior Director of Information Security at Barracuda Networks. My team is responsible for all of our product security, as well as a number of other things around the company. I've been doing security here for about 6 years after about a 22, 23-year period of product development. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to join today. Thanks.
Great stuff, thank you. So let's get moving. So what we're gonna do is we have the following agenda. We'll very quickly go through some of the struggles that I'm sure you folks know you're facing. We don't need to spend a ton of time there. Talk about the different incentives between development and security. And then we're gonna try to spend a fair amount of time hearing from Dave describe the real deal in terms of what he's been doing with bridging the gap between development and security in his organization. Of course, they've got a pretty broad level of things they have to cover, including appliances and cloud. So it should be an interesting discussion. Then I'll jump back in and talk a little bit about how we see our customers integrating crowdsourced security into the development lifecycle. And we'll go back to Dave and get some feedback on what he's been able to do in that space. So we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, there's the question function inside GoToWebinar. So please just use that and enter your question, and then we'll take them in the order that they were received at the end. So I won't spend a lot of time on this one because I think you folks on the call are all familiar with the struggles that people in cybersecurity are grappling with. Obviously, the attackers have the advantage because they're much more motivated, incentivized to succeed. They only have to succeed once. People in security have to deal with not only the legacy equipment they tend to have in the organization, they also have to deal with the move to cloud. They also have to deal with the move to agile, and budgets may be keeping pace with IT, but they're not increasing as a percentage of IT, which means you basically have double or triple the work, but the same amount of budget you had before. The other thing I'll point out with respect to skills shortages is we all know there aren't enough security people to go around, but the other side of the coin is there's a lot of functions in security that you couldn't justify hiring somebody full-time for anyway. You don't keep a plumber on staff full-time if you only need them to work on the pipes once a month. You bring them in when you need them. So there really is a place for some level of security skills to be available more on a temporary basis anyway, not a full-time basis. That contributes to the problem. Now, if you're turning to Agile specifically, we tend to see three key challenges that come up. The first one is just basically speed. Obviously, development cycles are changing a lot, becoming much shorter. I was talking to one of our customers yesterday, and he said, well, we're doing pen tests twice a year, but we're rolling code out every week. So obviously that doesn't work too well for us, right? The other thing is the way code is being built is changing. It's less custom work and a lot of more assembly work. And then the question is, how well are the teams working because they're under such deadlines in terms of working on the interactions between the chunks of code. So security definitely has a speed matching problem, because as we all know, traditional security architectures tend to be, well, I'll put this box in here and that policy over there, and I'll update the firewall rules or the IPS signatures on such and such basis. It's just not relevant for agile development situations anymore. The other problem is conflicting goals. Most people who write software are under pressure to do it faster and faster. I was up in the Northwest last week. I was talking to a credit union. The CISO was present in the room, fortunately, and the first thing out of his mouth was, we have a pain point behind rolling software out faster. Now, this is a credit union, mind you, right? It's not some high-tech startup here in San Francisco. So they're under a lot of pressure to put code out as quickly as possible. Security obviously has a completely different set of goals. And so the question is, how do you rationalize the two, especially when the real center of power tends to be in the lines of business where the code is getting written. And then lastly, the move to Agile requires a new set of skills. The watchword, of course, for Agile rapid development, CI/CD, is automation. Nobody does things manually. But most security people are not coders or scripters. They don't know how to work with APIs. It's just not their thing. So they need to acquire new skills in order to get them more up to speed to participate in what is largely an automated cycle of development. So with that, let me turn it over to Dave, who will give an overview of what he's doing with respect to security, and also some of the work he's done with crowdsourced security, because he's been working with us for several years now. Dave, over to you.
You bet. Thank you. So back in 2010, bug bounty programs were a very, very new thing, and our security research arm decided to launch a private bug program, or bounty program. And they managed that for a couple of years. I joined that program in about 2012. And at that time, the program was limited in scope to our appliances. And at that point in time, our company was largely just an appliance company. We were the largest purpose-built appliance company in the world. And that program was very successful. When we really started to engage the community, and as the bug bounty community really began to take off, I ended up with 4 full-time staff just handling the volume of submissions coming in. And if you've ever dealt with a private bug bounty program before, you'll know that there's a lot of noise that comes in. There are a lot of people that will throw Acunetics at your product and mail you the report and say, can I has bounty? And they'll say it persistently. They'll ask you over and over again. So around 2014, one of the researchers that had been participating in our program had actually come to work for us, and he came and told us that the BugCrowd was really the place to be. So we joined up with BugCrowd, and that was a huge burden off of our security team. Just the fact that we no longer had to handle paying the researchers was a huge benefit. The triage that the BugCrowd team did for us was a huge benefit. It was such an effective program for us that I think it was 2016, somewhere in there, we decided to start a private bounty program for our web services, our web applications, because in that time, the company had largely pivoted from being exclusively an appliance company to being a web service company. We launched a ton of web services, first with our Barracuda backup service, and then the message archiving service, and the email security service, and the list continues to grow. But the other thing that Barracuda is we're a portfolio company. I think every time I turn around, there's a new product popping up, and the bug bounty program has been so effective for us in our security program that whenever a new product pops up, we've got to make a decision about whether we're going to roll that out again. Whether we're going to roll out a bug bounty program for that product. And I was very pleased this year when the BugCrowd team came to me and said, hey, this is going to be kind of a painful process to talk about this every time we turn around. How about we set you up with a site license so that every time you've got a new product coming in, we don't have to renegotiate commercial terms. We can just spin up a new product in product scope in a program, and we can get the crowd looking at your product. So that BugCrowd has really worked closely with us as a trusted partner. They're I would say my favorite vendor to work with. So that's the overview of our program.
Great. You want to move on?
Yeah. All right. So this is how our process looked back in 2010. Actually, our process still looks very much like this. We source vulnerabilities, we refine vulnerabilities, and we remediate them. The sourcing, I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is we handle incoming bug reports, we correspond with researchers, we deal with clarifying the reports, validating that the reports are accurate, clarifying the write-ups so that the reproduction steps are valid. But once we've got a solid vulnerability sourced for product A, the way that our products are built in many cases is they're built on a shared platform. So the refined vulnerability step is where the security team will then spend some time reasoning about the vulnerability that's been sourced and say, what other products are likely to be impacted by this? And then they will need to go out and actually check each of those potentially impacted products and determine whether they're impacted as well. So one vulnerability coming in to our program might actually turn into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more specific project vulnerabilities. And we actually will clone those vulnerabilities out to each of the product specific teams so that they get into their workflows to remediate. And then we need to spend time doing the communications with those teams and sort of keeping the fire lit under them to remediate them. So when we first came to BugCrowd, a huge amount of the security team's time was spent on the sourcing vulnerability side, and in particular was spent in getting the researchers to clarify their write-ups. It was in arguing with them over their assessment of the severity of vulnerabilities. It was spent in pouring through denied parties lists to make sure that the researcher was eligible to be paid and wasn't on a do not pay terrorist list. All kinds of things that I didn't want our security team to be spending their time doing. What I wanted them to be doing was spending their time identifying the impact to our products and to our customers and working with our product teams to get those things remediated. Next slide, please. And so this is where BugCrowd stepped in. When we launched our first program with BugCrowd and all of the scopes that have been added to it since, BugCrowd has taken off our plates all of the effort required to pay the researchers, which was a huge chunk of time. They also are responsible for corresponding with the researchers so that if you do get someone who's fairly junior and doesn't realize that mailing in an Accunetic scan result is not really doing research, the BugCrowd team handles those communications. So what we get coming out of our BugCrowd program is a vetted vulnerability write-up that has been, in most cases, the BugCrowd team is able to reproduce those with the equipment that they've got. And there are some cases where they just don't have access to the product. Some of our appliance things are hard to reproduce in their lab. But for the most part, we get reproduced vulnerabilities sent over to us. And so my team was able to spend their time actually refining their vulnerabilities and identifying where else in the company this reported vulnerability impacted us. That meant that I was able to free up. I went from having 4 people full-time managing incoming vulnerabilities. Today, I've got 1 guy full-time managing the BugCrowd program and working with our product teams to remediate the issues and doing vulnerability management. And his time is largely spent working with folks on remediation recommendations and on validating their fixes. We have a contract with our product teams that when we send them a vulnerability, they're responsible for fixing it, and they're responsible for testing that the fix that they implemented won't break their product, and that our team will then really exercise their fix to make sure that the fix is complete from a security perspective. We had a difficult time keeping up with that contract when we were still working so much in the sourcing vulnerabilities section. BugCrowd has made it possible for us to really deliver on that contract much more effectively.
Cool, thanks for that, Dave. It's interesting, I was talking to a different customer the other day who had been, it's like you, started with their own program and then moved to a managed program. And the comment from the gentleman was, my treasury department hated me because not only did his team have to do a lot of work exactly like your folks did originally, handling the incoming submissions, but because they had to do the payments through the corporation, this was a very large enterprise, they had to work with the Treasury Department on payments, and he said it was a real pain in the butt, especially for domestic payments, because you get into all these tax implications. So the problems associated with running your own program, and at least in his case, weren't even limited to security team. It had a knock-on effect in the rest of the organization.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, my favorite story about paying a researcher was that one of the researcher's addresses included the statement, "Behind the beauty shop on the left." How you get your corporate accounting department to wire or send money to that address is challenging, and in many cases those people couldn't accept American money. I don't know how Barracuda, how BugCrowd does it, but I'm glad to leave that to you guys.
Yes, we have multiple payment schemes, and absolutely, when you get out of the U.S., then you get into those kinds of issues. The other issue this guy said is, like, they once had to pay out a very big payout because they had a huge bug, and then the problem was the Treasury Department didn't want to pay an individual that much money. They're asking, is this your cousin or something like that? So it went on and on. So they were quite happy to be rid of the problem. So what we'll do now is I'll take over for a few minutes and I'll talk about some of the capabilities that we've launched recently in our crowdsourced security programs that help bridge the gap even more from where we've been today, because we're talking about really focusing on that agile workflow. There's 3 things that I want to highlight. The first one is moving to a continuous program. A lot of our customers, when they first come in, they use us to replace a pen test. They might have multiple pen testers in a rotation, and they say, well, let's try this instead and see how it goes. And as things go well, then they might do more and more of it. They do that for several reasons. One is, frankly, results, because of the way our crowd is able to find the logic problems that the typical pen tester can't find in the limited time they've got. The reduction of risk is just stronger. The other issue is scheduling. I was talking to somebody and they said, well, what we do is the way our development goes is it's like dev, test, stage, prod, and between stage and prod, there's a 1-week window when we security are allowed to come in and do our thing. But the problem is that 1-week window might slide 7 times as the project goes on. It's obviously completely out of our control. We'll find out very late in the game, and then it's too late for us to schedule a pen tester to come in because they need several weeks of notice. So that's causing pain for them. They said sometimes what they've done is they've actually had people, they paid people to remain idle just so they can have them ready when the window opens. So that's an issue that comes up fairly regularly, actually. So you clearly want to move more to a continuous model as you're rolling code out, monthly, weekly, daily, hourly, whatever it is. That actually works very well with a crowdsourcing model, because fresh code to a researcher is frankly fresh meat, right? If there's new code out there, that means there's a good chance that there's new vulnerabilities. The first person to find the vulnerability is the one who's going to get paid, so there's an incentive for them to respond quickly. So it's very, very different from a pen test situation where it's scheduled in advance. The people have a limited time and fixed methodology they have to go through, get the report over, throw it over. It's just a whole different thing. It also allows flexibility of skills. Obviously, with respect to Barracuda, as Dave said, they've got both appliance and cloud web properties. We're seeing people who are asking for those two sorts of things. I'm sorry, those or appliances like Dave has, or for example, they're asking for testing of their AWS or Azure implementations. Their concern is that the VPC or whatever they built out hasn't been properly set up. So they're worried about configuration options because they know for moving to infrastructure as a service, they read all the reports that say if there's going to be a flaw, it's probably because the end customer misconfigured something, authentication to an S3 bucket or something like that. So the flexibility of skills is another important part of it. The middle one is efficiency of workflow. So what we've been trying to do is, as much as possible, build out our integration with Jira in particular, and we'll talk about that on a subsequent slide, with the goal towards making it as easy as possible for both AppSec and for development to work on the bug. And then the last one is training and education. Development teams, obviously, some are better than security than others. Anything we can do to help them both remediate and learn makes them more efficient. So we'll talk about that in a second as well. Now, on the Jira side, the problem is simple. The developers want to basically stay within their own workflow as much as possible. If you ask them to do some out-of-band process to handle bugs, which frankly they're not that keen on working on in the first place, you're just going to create more friction than you need to. So we've really doubled down on our integration, in particular with Jira. We do support other workflow solutions using our API, but we've really tried to focus on Jira. Now, this is a simplified document of how things go down. The reality is there are multiple architectures that customers might use to handle integration with Jira workflow and security. The basic situation, as Dave sort of suggested, is we find the vulnerability, we do all that triage, cleanup, prioritization, etc., and then we hand it over to AppSec. The AppSec people then, groups like Dave, then take it, decide what to do with it, and then push it into the Jira workflow. We typically see one of three models being used. In some cases, the customer has a Jira project specific to security, and they park them there, and then they clone them into the project Jira, the developers' Jira projects where they work on them directly. We've seen ones where the security team doesn't have their own project, they push them directly to the engineers' projects, and then we've seen the opposite where they try to retain them all within a project specific to security. The last one is the most problematic because now you're asking the developers to jump into the security guys' workflow. It's not something they want to do. So we tend to see people either using both the AppSec side and the developer side projects, or just the developer. And so, and that's what we're trying to do, is support all three. There's all kinds of variations on them. And I think, as Dave rightly pointed out, he mentioned, the reality is there's gonna have to be some triaging from the AppSec team when the vulnerability comes in. Even if it's perfectly formatted, the folks in AppSec have to make a decision about which project does this go to. Or as Dave mentioned, in his case, they might have to clone it because there's three different projects that have to deal with the bug because the code exists in all three of them. That's where you need the intelligence and knowledge of the people who work in the organization to make the decision. Frankly, automating that is something that is a bit down the road. So what we're trying to do is provide as much support as possible for people like Dave and his team, so they can just focus on those decisions they have to do and not worry about cleaning up the vulnerability itself. And then lastly, there's that business of training remediation advice. So what we've entered into the product more recently is inside each one of the vulnerability submissions, we provide remediation advice. This is a no-cost ability that's put into the platform. And it basically provides advice to the developer specific to the bug on how they can fix it. It also provides resources for the developer if they want to learn more about secure coding practices relevant for this particular area. And we've actually gotten a lot of uptake and interest on that because in general, developers are not fantastic at security or it's hit and miss. And anything you can do to make it easier for them, not only to fix the particular bug quicker, but also to learn how to avoid in future is a win-win for everybody. Obviously, if they learn not to repeat the mistake, the company is less exposed and there's less work when the bug crops up somewhere else. So that remediation advice is available to all our customers. It's also open source, so we welcome input to improve it and add to it because obviously this is a very fast-moving environment. At that point, I'll turn it over to Dave. If you've got any other comments on basically that last bit of the process, I think you touched on it before, but anything you'd like to add with respect to that last piece of remediation of the vulnerabilities?
Actually, that feeds right into this slide here. Part of the process of refining vulnerabilities is writing up the recommended resolution. We may spend some time actually digging into the code sometimes and see if we can identify the root cause, so be even more specific about the remediation recommendations. But the general remediation recommendation guidelines that can come over into JIRA from the platform cuts down the amount of documentation that the one guy managing the system or this program has to do now. And that means that he can spend much more time on doing validations of fixes and doing risk modeling. One of the things that we find is super important is that our development teams really want to know how serious is this? What's the real risk? And so we are leaned upon to give them meaningful risk analysis about the issue. It'd be very easy to throw the bug over the wall and say, yeah, it's a bug, it just needs to be fixed. But the reality is that everybody in the organization has limited resources. And so we need to be doing our part to make sure that we are investing our resources wisely. And so Bugcrowd is becoming a partner in the refinement process has helped free up time for us to do the risk modeling, do the fix validations, which is really where I want my guys spending their time.
Cool. Thank you very much. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Basically, the bottom line value that we're delivering to our customers like Dave are reduced operational overhead. We've heard that in spades from him directly. There's no point in me repeating. It's much more interesting seeing what he's actually doing. Accelerating the remediation by providing the information that the developer needs to fix it faster. And of course, all of this leads to reducing risk, right? Being able to bring the power of the crowd to the actual risks that the coders are putting out there and then dealing with it quicker is all about reducing risk. And so really we see the customers that focus on bug bounty programs or vulnerability disclosure programs are the ones that are taking risk reduction seriously, and they're looking for multiple ways to approach it. And crowdsourced security fits very cleanly into that infrastructure. So with that, we're going to turn it over to questions. So what we'll do is we'll wait about 10 seconds. If you have a question, go ahead and put it into the chat box. And then I've already got a couple here. Dave, just to warn you, you're going to get the first one. So let's just hold on for 1 second. Okay, and let's get started. So this one is for you, Dave. The person says, what tips do you have to get dev teams to take security more seriously?
So that's an interesting question. The way that I measure how seriously they take it is the length of time that it takes for them to completely roll out a fix for a significant issue. And the reality of at least our world is that I'm only one person asking our development teams to produce things. And unfortunately for me, unfortunately for security, I'm not the one that has the final say on whether those folks get promoted or get bonuses. You know, they're beholden to their chain of command and to their product managers. And so just walking in and saying I have a serious bug will get a lot of people's attention. It'll get most developers' attention. But I've frequently run into cases where I've gotten pushback from product managers because they're balancing, you know, the real opportunity costs of slowing down development to fix a bug. Now, my experience has been that when we can make a solid case that the bug presents a real risk, that they do prioritize and get it done. But probably the most effective method that I've found for getting that engagement and making it happen quickly, or at least making the discussions about the risk happen quickly, is by publishing metrics, risk metrics publicly. And the way that we do that is that when we do our refinement of the bug, we'll go through and apply a CVSS score to the bug. Actually, we'll apply a minimum and a maximum CVSS score, because the environment that a particular issue appears in can actually vary based on, you know, where, for example, an appliance is deployed. So we do need to provide a range of severities for a particular issue. And we do that in Jira. We created some custom fields in Jira. We add those the CVSS vectors and their numeric scores. And then we have a tool that rolls that risk up and applies it to the owner of the project. So we've determined that the lead product manager on each project is the person responsible for all of the risk. And so we've written a little tool that will sum up all of the unpatched vulnerabilities in a particular product, add their max CVSS scores together, and put the name of the product manager on that total risk score for the product. And then it rolls those scores all the way up through the organization. So if I were the CEO, for example, I can look at the amount of risk allocated to each of my direct reports. And as we started rolling that out, we don't actually use that super rigorously. But anytime that we get any resistance in engaging, we can just pull that up and take a look at it. As a matter of fact, the guy that's managing our program, I actually believe, uses that on a weekly basis or on a regular basis when he meets with the product teams. And it has been so effective at keeping folks engaged that we don't generally need to roll that up to the executive level.
Yeah,
that publicly keeping score makes sense. You know, winners like to keep score, and we have a lot of winners on our teams.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing from other customers who they struggle with the same thing about how to get the development teams to hit the stuff. And what seems to be the most common thing is to some form of what you're talking about, Dave, where there's some sort of more sort of public or like internal public reporting on performance. And it's more, whether it's the wall of shame or whoever's winning, as you said, whatever it is, the variations on the same thing. People don't like to be at the bottom, and they certainly like to be at the top. So that a lot of times is the most important thing. The next one's just come up. It's just kind of a variation of what I talked about before, which was I don't have Jira. What can I do? The API that we wrote for integration downstream is very well documented. It's publicly available, and we've had customers easily use that API to integrate with their own workflow. We really focused heavily on strong APIs for the downstream submission form, like when a vulnerability is submitted and then we push it along to the customer, because that obviously is the most important interaction you're going to have between a bug bounty program and your own organization. So it's actually quite straightforward, and our guys can help out if necessary. We have one more question that's really more aligned with you, Dave, and it's sort of a variation of what came up before, and it's about this question of misaligned priorities between security teams and developers. So is there any other tips and tricks, maybe variation on the same thing, that you do to get the developers more on side?
Yep, absolutely. I actually love this question because when I really first started engaging our bug bounty program, it really felt to me like there was an enormous misalignment between our product teams and our security team. And it felt for all the world like we were the only ones that cared about security. I agree, looking back now, that there was a priority misalignment, but what I've learned is that it was not a one-sided deal. The alignment, sorry, the priorities of the security team were frequently somewhat misaligned with the priorities of the business. And so I would say that the most important thing that we can do as security practitioners to really help align things is to become familiar with the environment that those product teams are working in. Right? If you've got a security problem that's a moderate risk, but delaying the shipment of a project is going to cost you a multi-million-dollar deal, the risk to the business in slowing that down is pretty substantial. And so we had to learn at Barracuda to become partners with the development organization and to learn what was going on in their world, to educate them about what was going on in our world, and to reason together about the entire risk proposition. It's very easy as a security practitioner to say, we need to fix all the bugs and patch all the systems. And in an ideal world, we would do that. And in an ideal world, my experience as a development manager was we would fix all of the low severity bugs as well, because we want the best product possible. But the reality is this is an economic proposition, and we have scarce resources to apply to the situation. And we need to be part of that discussion as a partner and not as an adversary. And that, to me, has been the most effective way for us to align our priorities. So when the product teams find us negotiating with them as partners, we get much better engagement, and we get much further than we did if they feel like they have to defend themselves from us.
Excellent. Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Dave. We don't have any more questions. So if you folks on the call come up with anything else after that, we invite you to visit our website and you can submit a question there. Otherwise, I have a big thanks to Dave for making time. Much appreciated. I'm sure our audience appreciates hearing from an actual customer. So thanks again, Dave, for making time.
Thanks for having me.
And we thank everybody for attending the webinar, and we hope you all have a great day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.